I'll never forget the day I, Alex, 32, first realized that my identical twin brother Ethan wasn't quite right. We grew up in a picturesque Seattle suburb where our father built a thriving tech consultancy and our mother managed the administrative side of the business. From the outside, we appeared to be the perfect American family. Successful parents, identical twin boys, beautiful colonial home with perfectly trimmed hedges. But behind our home's elegant facade, a disturbing dynamic had taken root years before I even had the vocabulary to describe it. Despite being twins, born just 4 minutes apart, Ethan quickly became the golden child while I was perpetually cast as the responsible, reliable, ultimately forgettable brother. This dynamic became obvious when we received our first bicycles for our 8th birthday. Mine was a basic model from the local department store, while Ethan's was a premium brand with all the extras our parents could afford. When I questioned this disparity, my mother simply shrugged and said, "Ethan needs more encouragement than you do." That simple statement contained the essence of our entire childhood. I was expected to understand, to accommodate, to give way to Ethan's needs and wants. The pattern continued relentlessly throughout our formative years. When I saved for months to buy a gaming console, Ethan destroyed it in a fit of rage after I refused to let his friends use it unsupervised. Rather than holding him accountable, my parents bought him a newer, more expensive model the following weekend, explaining that sharing would have prevented the situation entirely. My console was never replaced, and I was left watching Ethan enjoy the fruits of my punishment. In junior high, I rescued an abandoned kitten and nursed it back to health, naming her Luna and forming a deep attachment. One afternoon after I refused to let Ethan borrow my new headphones, I returned from soccer practice to find Luna severely ill. The vet confirmed she'd ingested something toxic, and despite emergency treatment, she didn't survive. When I confronted Ethan, he simply smirked and said, "It was just a stupid cat anyway." My parents' response cut deeper than Ethan's cruelty. They suggested I wasn't responsible enough to care for a pet, completely absolving Ethan of any wrongdoing despite the suspicious timing and his history of vindictive behavior. What made Ethan particularly dangerous was his carefully constructed public persona. To teachers, neighbors, and family friends, he was charming, helpful, and seemingly compassionate. He volunteered at community events, helped elderly neighbors with yard work, and maintained excellent grades. This exterior performance was so convincing that when his true nature occasionally slipped through, no one believed the glimpse of darkness was anything but a misunderstanding. By high school, Ethan had perfected his manipulation tactics, understanding that his pristine reputation gave him powerful protection. He would regularly sabotage my friendships and relationships, spreading rumors with just enough plausibility that they took root and flourished. My first serious girlfriend, Maddie, abruptly ended our relationship after 6 months when Ethan convinced her I was secretly seeing someone from another school. The accusation was completely fabricated, but Ethan's sincere delivery and reputation for honesty made the lie impossible to combat. My parents, rather than questioning Ethan's motives, suggested that perhaps I hadn't been attentive enough to Maddie's needs, implying that I had somehow invited this outcome. The most insidious aspect of Ethan's behavior was how he systematically isolated me, ensuring that I remained alone while he thrived socially. He would ingratiate himself with my friend groups, gradually turning them against me with subtle comments and manufactured incidents. By senior year, I had developed a defensive approach to relationships, keeping people at a distance to protect them from Ethan's inevitable interference. This strategy further reinforced the community's perception that Ethan was the outgoing, friendly twin, while I was standoffish and difficult. When we graduated high school, Ethan received a costly car as a gift while I got a watch. The disparity explained away as recognition of his exceptional achievements. The reality was that our GPAs were nearly identical, but Ethan had cultivated relationships with teachers and participated in visible community service, creating the impression that he was extraordinarily accomplished. I left for college determined to create distance between us, choosing a university across the country while Ethan stayed local, working for our father's company. For the first time in my life, I began to experience what normal social interactions felt like without Ethan's shadow looming over every relationship I formed. In college and early adulthood, I established a pattern of keeping romantic partners completely separate from my family, particularly Ethan. This strategy worked reasonably well, though it created complications when relationships became serious enough that meeting family would be expected. Each time I introduced a girlfriend to my family, Ethan would find ways to undermine the relationship. Sometimes his approach was direct, flirting inappropriately or making suggestive comments when no one else could hear. Other times he employed more subtle tactics, such as telling my girlfriend's parents I had gambling problems or revealing fabricated concerns about my character to her friends. My parents invariably supported his version of events, believing his expressions of concern were genuine rather than calculated to destroy my happiness. After several relationships collapsed following family introductions, I began to believe I would never find lasting happiness as long as Ethan remained in my life. The pattern seemed inescapable. Any woman I cared for would eventually become a target for Ethan's obsessive need to take what was mine. By the time I turned 30, I had built a successful career as a software engineer at a respected tech firm and maintained a small circle of close friends. But I had all but abandoned hope of finding a life partner who could withstand the inevitable storm that would follow a meeting with my twin brother. After enduring this toxic dynamic for decades, everything changed when I met Rebecca at a hospital fundraiser where my company was a corporate sponsor. She was a pediatric surgeon with a brilliant mind and a compassion that extended far beyond her professional responsibilities. Our connection was immediate and profound. She laughed at my awkward jokes, challenged my perspectives, and saw past the defensive walls I'd constructed over years of conditioning. For the first time, I found myself sharing the truth about Ethan and my family with someone I was dating, laying bare the painful history I typically kept hidden. Rebecca listened without judgment, occasionally asking perceptive questions that suggested she understood the psychological dynamics at play better than I did myself. When she finally responded, her perspective was unexpected. "It sounds like your brother has some serious psychological issues that your parents have enabled his entire life." She theorized that perhaps Ethan had never developed proper empathy or emotional regulation because he'd never faced consequences for his actions. While I appreciated her insights, a familiar dread settled in my stomach at the thought of introducing Rebecca to my family. The pattern was too established, too predictable. Ethan would target her, my parents would enable him, and I would lose the most meaningful relationship I'd ever found. Despite my reservations, Rebecca insisted that avoiding my family entirely wasn't sustainable long-term. "Relationships can heal over time," she said, with the optimism of someone who hadn't witnessed Ethan's destructive capabilities firsthand. After 3 months of dating, I reluctantly agreed to bring Rebecca to a family dinner, praying that Ethan had somehow outgrown his pathological jealousy in the years since our last disastrous family gathering. The moment we walked through my parents' front door for dinner, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The shift in Ethan's expression when he first saw Rebecca was subtle but unmistakable. A predatory gleam flashed across his features before his face settled into its practiced charm. He practically knocked our mother aside to be the first to embrace Rebecca, holding her uncomfortably long until she physically disengaged herself. My mother laughed off the awkward moment, commenting that Ethan was just being welcoming, while my father beamed proudly at his sociable son. Throughout dinner, I watched Ethan with mounting anxiety as he deployed his usual tactics, finding excuses to brush against Rebecca's hand when passing dishes, leaning unnecessarily close when speaking to her, and peppering the conversation with stories designed to diminish me in her eyes. "Did Alex ever tell you about how he practiced for weeks to ask Melissa Parker to prom, then vomited all over her shoes when he finally worked up the courage?" Ethan asked with exaggerated amusement, conveniently omitting that I'd been battling food poisoning that day and that he had orchestrated the humiliating encounter knowing I was ill. My parents laughed indulgently at this blatant character assassination, with my mother adding, "Alex was always so nervous around girls," as if this was a charming family anecdote rather than a calculated undermining of my confidence. The situation deteriorated further when dessert was served. Ethan, who had been seated across from Rebecca during dinner, somehow maneuvered to sit beside her, physically inserting himself between us at the table. As we ate apple pie, he attempted to feed Rebecca a bite from his fork, maintaining uncomfortable eye contact until she was forced to verbally decline. I seethed silently, caught in the familiar trap of knowing that any confrontation would be twisted to make me appear jealous or unstable. After dinner, Rebecca offered to help with cleanup while I assisted my father with moving some storage boxes. When I returned to the kitchen, I found Ethan standing inappropriately close to Rebecca by the sink, his arm positioned to block her exit path. "Alex has always been the safe choice," he was saying in a low, insinuating tone. "But don't you ever wonder what it would be like with someone who could actually excite you?" Rebecca's posture was rigid, her back pressed against the counter, as she maintained as much distance as possible between them. "I've asked you twice to give me some space," she stated firmly, though I could hear the tension underlying her composure. The relief on her face when she saw me enter the room made my blood boil. Ethan merely laughed, clapping me on the shoulder as he departed, saying, "Your girl's way too serious, bro. You should tell her to lighten up," as if we were sharing some fraternal joke rather than him having crossed a serious boundary. In the car driving home, Rebecca remained uncharacteristically quiet, staring out the window as Seattle's rainy streets blurred past. When she finally spoke, her assessment chilled me. "Your brother isn't what I expected. He's more deliberate than how you described him." When I asked what she meant, she elaborated, "The way you talked about him, I pictured someone more obviously aggressive or mean, but he's subtle. Each action seems innocent if viewed individually, but together they form a pattern that's deeply unsettling." She shook her head, processing the evening's events. "I understand now why your parents don't see it. He's masterful at making inappropriate behavior seem normal or accidental." I gripped the steering wheel, apologizing for subjecting her to the experience, but Rebecca surprised me. "No, I needed to see it. The way your parents enable his behavior explains so much about what you've been through." I suggested avoiding family gatherings for the foreseeable future, and Rebecca agreed, though she seemed distracted, likely replaying the evening's uncomfortable encounters in her mind. What neither of us realized then was that Ethan had no intention of respecting our boundaries or allowing Rebecca to simply walk away from his newly focused attention. His behavior at dinner wasn't just opportunistic. It was the opening move in what would become a calculated campaign of harassment and intimidation designed to claim Rebecca as his own or destroy her in the attempt. The harassment began 3 days later when Rebecca received a call from an unknown number while preparing for her morning rounds at the hospital. When she answered, she was met with heavy breathing before the caller abruptly disconnected. She dismissed it as a wrong number, but by the end of the day, she'd received another call from a different, unrecognized number. This time, a male voice said, "You're not as hot as Ethan said you were. Still stuck up, though," before hanging up. Rebecca was understandably disturbed when she told me about the calls that evening. "The weird part is they knew my name," she said, brow furrowed in concern. I immediately suspected Ethan, but didn't want to jump to conclusions without evidence. Within a week, Rebecca had blocked 6 different numbers, with voicemails becoming increasingly specific and threatening, mentioning details like, "Nice blue scrubs today," or "Saw you grabbing coffee at Starbucks this morning," making it clear she was being actively watched and followed. When I listened to one of the recorded messages, I immediately recognized the voice of Curtis, Ethan's best friend since high school and willing accomplice in past harassment campaigns. My suspicion was confirmed when Rebecca received a text reading, "Playing hard to get is cute, but getting old. You know you'd rather be with a real man instead of his loser brother." The message carried Ethan's unmistakable contempt, disguised as flirtation. Rebecca, who had always projected confident self-assurance, began exhibiting signs of chronic stress and anxiety. She started checking her rearview mirror constantly during her commute, calling me when walking to her car after night shifts, and jumping whenever her phone notifications sounded. The strong, independent woman I had fallen in love with was being systematically worn down by Ethan's psychological warfare, and watching her transformation ignited a protective rage I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about me anymore. Rebecca deserved none of this torment, and I refused to stand by while Ethan destroyed another relationship. Without informing Rebecca, I arranged to meet Ethan at a local park, texting simply, "Meet me at Volunteer Park in an hour. No excuses." He responded almost immediately with a casual, "Damn, you sound serious. All right, big bro, let's chat." When I arrived at the nearly empty park, Ethan was already waiting, leaning against his luxury car with arms crossed and a smug expression that suggested he'd been anticipating this confrontation. I approached him directly, invading his personal space in a way I'd never dared before. "You stay the hell away from Rebecca," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You and your pathetic followers. This ends now." Ethan's response was a condescending chuckle and headshake. "God, you're so predictable, always playing the protective boyfriend. Tell me, does she even like that, or is she just waiting for someone with a little more intensity?" Before Ethan could continue his taunting, I grabbed the front of his expensive shirt and slammed him against his car, an unprecedented physical escalation in our lifelong power struggle. For a brief moment, his customary mask of smug superiority faltered, replaced by something resembling surprise, perhaps even fear, before he recovered his composure. "This isn't high school anymore, Ethan," I snarled, maintaining my grip on his collar. "You don't get to play your mind games with Rebecca. You so much as look in her direction again, and I swear to God I will make you regret it." Ethan tilted his head, studying me with clinical detachment, before releasing a slow, mocking laugh that communicated his utter dismissal of my threat. I slammed him against the car again, harder this time, causing him to momentarily lose his breath. "Try me," I challenged, meaning every word. For perhaps the first time in his life, Ethan didn't have an immediate retort. His carefully maintained facade slipped just long enough for me to glimpse the calculating coldness beneath before he recovered, smoothing his shirt with affected nonchalance after I released him. "Jesus, Alex, lighten up. It's all in good fun," he said with a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. As I turned to leave, his parting words confirmed what I already knew. My confrontation had only escalated the situation. "You know, the more you try to keep her away from me, the more she's going to wonder what she's missing," he called after me, his tone light, but laced with unmistakable malice. I knew then that Ethan wasn't going to stop. This wasn't just about tormenting me anymore. He had fixated on Rebecca, and in his distorted worldview, my protection of her had transformed this into a challenge he couldn't resist. As expected, the harassment intensified following my confrontation with Ethan. Curtis and another of Ethan's friends, a former college wrestler named Derek, began appearing at the hospital, stationing themselves in the pediatric waiting area for hours without legitimate purpose. When questioned by staff, they would claim to be waiting for someone or checking on a relative, but their only activity was watching Rebecca's movements throughout her shift. Rebecca's department head noticed her increasingly anxious behavior and declining performance, creating professional consequences beyond the personal toll she was already enduring. The breaking point came 3 weeks after our ill-fated family dinner, when Rebecca called me at 11:30 p.m., her voice trembling with barely controlled panic. "There's someone following me," she whispered. "I'm in my car in the hospital parking garage, but I'm afraid to drive home. Alex, I'm scared." I grabbed my keys without hesitation, assuring her I was on my way, and instructing her to lock her doors and stay on the phone with me. As I raced to the hospital, my mind cycled through increasingly violent scenarios of confrontation. Rebecca's next shift started in just 8 hours, and if she missed it due to this harassment, her carefully built career could begin unraveling. The situation had reached a critical point where immediate action was required. Rebecca's safety, her career, and our future together hung in the balance, threatened by Ethan's pathological inability to see me happy. When I reached the hospital parking garage, I found Rebecca huddled in her car, constantly scanning her mirrors with vigilant fear. Derek's unmistakable red truck was parked 2 spaces away, its engine still warm though he had fled upon seeing my arrival. Rebecca was visibly shaking as she transferred to my passenger seat, her normally steady surgeon's hands trembling uncontrollably. I arranged for a friend to follow us home with Rebecca's car, ensuring we weren't being tailed. That night, as Rebecca finally succumbed to exhausted sleep, I made a decision I should have made years earlier. It was time to confront not just Ethan, but my parents' enabling behavior. The pattern of appeasement and avoidance had to end before Rebecca paid an unacceptable price for my family's dysfunction. The next morning, I gathered all the evidence of harassment: recordings of threatening calls, screenshots of disturbing texts, and security footage from the hospital showing Curtis and Derek loitering for hours near Rebecca's department. Armed with this documentation, I drove to my parents' home, knowing Ethan would be there before heading to work at my father's company. I found him in the kitchen, casually eating cereal and scrolling through his phone when I entered without knocking. My mother started to scold me about calling before visiting, but her reproach died on her lips when she saw my expression. Without preamble, I dropped my phone on the table in front of Ethan and played one of the most threatening voicemails. "We know when you get off work, Rebecca. Maybe you shouldn't walk to your car alone." Ethan glanced up from his breakfast with mild interest, as if I were showing him a mildly entertaining social media post rather than evidence of criminal harassment. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked with rehearsed innocence. I stared at him, contempt burning in my throat. "Cut the act, Ethan. I know Curtis and Derek are stalking Rebecca on your orders. Call them off, now." The most disturbing aspect of the confrontation was Ethan's utter lack of emotional reaction. His expression remained pleasant, even as the venom in his words revealed the darkness beneath. "Maybe if Rebecca wasn't such a tease, guys wouldn't feel the need to let her know she's not all that," he said calmly, taking another spoonful of cereal as if discussing the weather rather than admitting to orchestrating a harassment campaign. "Not my problem if she's giving out mixed signals." Something in me snapped at that moment. Decades of suppressed rage, of swallowing injustice, of watching Ethan destroy everything I valued while my parents enabled his pathological behavior. Without conscious thought, my fist connected with his face with such force that the impact reverberated through the kitchen like a gunshot. Ethan's head whipped back violently, milk and blood spraying across the pristine white table, as his lips split and nose gushed crimson. For the first time in his life, I saw genuine fear flash across his features before he began wailing dramatically, collapsing to the floor and clutching his face as if mortally wounded rather than simply experiencing consequences for his actions. My parents rushed into the kitchen, immediately assuming their lifelong roles as Ethan's protectors and enablers. My mother threw herself to her knees beside him, pressing a kitchen towel to his bloodied face while shooting venomous glares in my direction. "Oh my God, my baby!" she cried, cradling Ethan's head as he continued his theatrical display of suffering. My father advanced toward me, face contorted with fury. "What the hell is wrong with you, Alex?" he shouted, apparently oblivious to the evidence still playing on my phone. "Are you insane? You need professional help." I stared at them, breathing heavily, my knuckles stained with Ethan's blood, and felt an odd sense of clarity descend. These people weren't family in any meaningful sense of the word. They were co-conspirators in decades of psychological abuse, enablers who had sacrificed my well-being to accommodate Ethan's pathology. When I attempted to show them the evidence on my phone, they refused to even glance at it, completely uninterested in understanding why I had finally resorted to physical confrontation. My mother's next words confirmed the depth of their delusion. "Rebecca's been throwing herself at Ethan for weeks," she spat, her arm protectively encircling my brother. "What did you expect, Alex? You bring a pretty girl around and think Ethan wouldn't notice? Please. She's been leading him on, flirting with him, playing her little games. And now what? You can't handle a little competition, so you're making up these pathetic stories?" The word competition struck me like a second blow. In my parents' distorted reality, Ethan's obsessive stalking of my girlfriend constituted normal sibling rivalry rather than criminal behavior requiring intervention. "He's stalking her," I said, struggling to maintain composure. "His friends are following her at work. She's terrified to walk to her car alone. How can you not see what's happening?" My father's response was quiet but implacable. "Get out of this house. Don't come back until you've gotten professional help and apologized to your brother." As I turned to leave, I caught Ethan's eye over our mother's shoulder. Though his face was still contorted in a grimace of pain, his eyes revealed his true emotional state: smug satisfaction at having once again manipulated the situation to his advantage. He'd won again, or so he believed. On the drive home, my hands still trembling with adrenaline, I called Rebecca to warn her about the confrontation, knowing Ethan might escalate his behavior in retaliation. "So they didn't believe you?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had expected this outcome. "They didn't even look at the evidence," I confirmed, frustration evident in my voice. "Just jumped straight to defending Ethan and blaming you." When I arrived home, I found Rebecca sitting on our couch, knees pulled to her chest, fingers nervously fidgeting with the fabric of her sweater. "This isn't going to stop, is it?" she asked in a small voice I'd never heard from her before. I couldn't lie to her. "I don't think so. Not as long as Ethan's fixated on you and my parents keep enabling him." Rebecca swallowed hard, looking away as her fingers tightened on the fabric, and I was struck by a wave of guilt so powerful it nearly drove me to my knees. This brilliant, compassionate woman who saved children's lives daily was being terrorized because of her connection to me. I moved closer, gently tilting her chin up to meet my gaze, needing her to see the absolute conviction in my eyes. "Listen to me, Rebecca. I don't care what it takes. I don't care what I have to do. Ethan will never touch you. He will never take you from me. I will protect you, always." She blinked up at me, something shifting in her expression, then threw her arms around me, clinging with a desperation that communicated her fear more clearly than words ever could. I felt her trembling against me, her breath uneven against my neck, and silently renewed my promise. Ethan had taken so much from me throughout our lives: my childhood, my sense of security, my faith in family. But he would not take Rebecca. That night, we stopped passively waiting for the next assault and began actively preparing our defenses. I installed security cameras around our apartment, reinforced the locks, and established protocols to ensure Rebecca was never alone in vulnerable locations. Rebecca contacted her law school friend who specialized in restraining orders, beginning the paperwork that would create at least a legal barrier between her and Ethan's obsession. We weren't just defending ourselves anymore. We were actively fighting back against the psychological terrorism that had dominated our lives for weeks. Approximately a week after my confrontation with Ethan, my mother began an aggressive campaign of voicemails and text messages, leaving nearly 20 messages describing how devastated Ethan was by the misunderstanding and how he desperately wanted to apologize. She deployed emotionally manipulative language about family healing and putting this ugliness behind us, presenting the situation as a simple brotherly disagreement rather than a pattern of stalking and harassment. When I showed Rebecca these messages, her response was immediate and firm. "Don't go. This feels like a trap." Her instincts were correct, of course, but I understood something about Ethan that she couldn't fully appreciate. If I refused the invitation, he would interpret my absence as fear, and in his twisted psychology, perceived weakness would only encourage escalation. This wasn't about reconciliation or family healing. This was about establishing boundaries that Ethan would be forced to respect. "We'll go together," I decided, adding a firm condition. "The first sign of anything suspicious, we leave immediately. I promise." No. When we arrived at my parents' home, we discovered the gathering was far larger than implied. My parents, Ethan, my aunt and uncle who had always favored Ethan, and most alarmingly, Curtis and Derek, the very men who had been stalking Rebecca at her workplace. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, instinctively positioning myself between Rebecca and the assembled group. My mother adopted a condescending tone reminiscent of a mediator addressing unruly children. "We're here to help you and Rebecca work through this situation," she explained, as if orchestrating an intervention rather than enabling harassment. What followed was 2 excruciating hours of coordinated gaslighting so comprehensive it bordered on psychological warfare. Each family member took turns explaining how Rebecca had obviously been flirting with Ethan at dinner, how she must have led him on, then panicked when she realized I might discover her behavior. Curtis and Derek portrayed their hospital visits as innocent coincidences, suggesting Rebecca was suffering from paranoia due to work stress rather than responding reasonably to being stalked. Throughout this orchestrated character assassination, Ethan played his part perfectly, appearing wounded and confused by Rebecca's misinterpretation of his friendly behavior. The most disturbing moment came when Derek began describing in detail which hospital corridors Rebecca had used on specific days, offering this information as proof she was seeking attention rather than evidence of his systematic surveillance. I watched Rebecca grow increasingly pale as they methodically attempted to make her doubt her own perceptions and experiences, a classic abuser tactic I'd seen Ethan deploy countless times throughout our lives. When Rebecca's breathing pattern changed, signaling the onset of a panic attack, I immediately stood, helping her to her feet. "We need to leave," I stated firmly, brooking no argument. My mother grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her expression hardening. "Alex, it's time to choose. Your real family or this girl who's clearly trying to come between us." I looked at her, really seeing her for perhaps the first time, not as my mother, but as Ethan's most dedicated enabler. A woman who had sacrificed one son's well-being on the altar of another's pathology. "Rebecca is my family now," I replied with quiet certainty. "And if you can't see what Ethan is doing, that's on you." The following day, Rebecca was summoned to her department head's office, where she learned that concerns had been raised about her professional conduct and emotional stability. Someone had been systematically spreading rumors throughout the hospital, suggesting Rebecca suffered from mental health issues that affected her judgment, that she had a history of making false accusations against male colleagues, and that her recent erratic behavior made her potentially unsafe around pediatric patients. The Whisper campaign carried all the hallmarks of Ethan's manipulation, seemingly concerned colleagues reporting worrying observations that individually seemed minor, but collectively painted a damaging portrait. Rebecca was presented with an impossible choice: accept a transfer to a different department, effectively abandoning the pediatric specialty she had trained years to enter, or face a formal review that would permanently mar her professional record. That evening, as we sat in stunned silence at our kitchen table, Rebecca received an email from a former medical school colleague about an opening for a pediatric surgeon at a hospital 300 miles away in Portland. Rebecca stared at the offer letter, her finger hovering over the trackpad before asking in a hollow voice, "He's not going to stop, is he?" I didn't bother pretending otherwise. The evidence of Ethan's determination to destroy Rebecca professionally if he couldn't possess her was irrefutable. "We're leaving," I decided aloud, the words feeling like liberation the moment they left my mouth. "We're done letting him control our lives. I don't care what it takes. I don't care if we have to start from scratch. We're getting the hell out of here, somewhere he can't touch us." Following my declaration, Rebecca and I implemented our escape plan with meticulous efficiency. Rebecca secured the position in Portland through a series of confidential interviews conducted via video calls and a discreet weekend visit. I negotiated a remote work arrangement with my company, citing personal circumstances without revealing the disturbing details. We found an apartment in a secure building with controlled access and comprehensive surveillance systems. We told absolutely no one about our destination except Rebecca's parents, who promised to maintain strict confidentiality, having witnessed firsthand the toll Ethan's harassment had taken on their daughter. We carefully staged our departure, leaving our Seattle apartment normally one morning as if heading to work, then immediately driving to Portland with only the essentials we'd secretly packed in our cars. We arranged for a moving company to retrieve our remaining belongings the following week, after we were safely established in our new location. The relief that washed over Rebecca as we crossed the Oregon state line was palpable. For the first time in months, her shoulders relaxed and her breathing eased. She reached across the center console to squeeze my hand, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "We're really doing this," she said, wonder mixing with lingering apprehension in her voice. I nodded, squeezing her hand in return. "We're really free." Neither of us fully believed it yet, but with each mile that separated us from Seattle, from Ethan's toxic orbit, hope gradually replaced fear as the dominant emotion guiding our journey. Our new life in Portland blossomed with unexpected swiftness. Rebecca thrived in her new hospital position, quickly establishing herself as a valued member of the pediatric surgical team. I maintained my professional responsibilities remotely, while exploring Portland's vibrant tech community for local opportunities. We made new friends, established new routines, and slowly began to lower the hyper-vigilant defenses we'd developed during Ethan's harassment campaign. For the first 3 months, we maintained absolute radio silence with my family, changing our phone numbers and setting up mail forwarding through a third-party service to ensure our physical address remained confidential. The psychological transformation in Rebecca was remarkable. The confident, compassionate woman I'd fallen in love with re-emerged from the shadow of fear that had enveloped her in Seattle. We began discussing marriage, no longer feeling that Ethan's inevitable interference rendered long-term planning futile. We were cautiously building the life together that had seemed impossible just months earlier when my cousin Kayla called. Kayla had always maintained a skeptical view of Ethan, having witnessed one of his manipulative episodes during childhood that my parents had successfully dismissed. She was calling to personally invite us to her wedding in Seattle, explaining that while Ethan would be attending due to family pressure, she had hired private security specifically assigned to monitor him and ensure our comfort. "You'll be seated with my fiancé's family, far from your parents," she assured us. "I want you both there, but I completely understand if it's too much." After careful consideration and lengthy discussion, Rebecca and I decided to attend Kayla's wedding, reasoning that a structured public event with security awareness presented minimal risk compared to the benefit of reconnecting with the few family members who had shown understanding of our situation. The ceremony proceeded without incident, with Ethan occupied by his responsibilities as a groomsman for Kayla's fiancé Joseph, who had no knowledge of the family's complicated dynamics. At the reception, we maintained our distance, sitting with Joseph's relatives while Ethan and my parents remained across the ballroom. For several hours, it seemed we might navigate the event without confrontation, especially as Rebecca began to relax enough to dance and laugh, behaviors I hadn't witnessed since before the harassment began. Around 9:00 p.m., Rebecca excused herself to use the restroom, while I continued a conversation with Joseph's brother. After approximately 10 minutes, I noticed Ethan was no longer at his assigned table. An instinctive alarm triggered in my mind, and I immediately excused myself to check on Rebecca. As I approached the restroom area, I heard Rebecca cry out, and my pace accelerated to a run. Joseph and his cousin Michael were approaching from the opposite direction and reached the scene moments before I did. But what I witnessed as I rounded the corner would be permanently seared into my consciousness. Ethan had Rebecca pinned against the wall in the dimly lit corridor outside the restrooms, one hand covering her mouth while the other gripped her arm with such force that his knuckles had blanched white. The delicate lace of her dress was torn at the shoulder and terror filled her eyes. Joseph and Michael were already pulling Ethan away as I arrived, Rebecca stumbling toward me, visibly shaking as I wrapped protective arms around her. Bruises in the distinct shape of fingerprints were already forming on her pale skin where Ethan had restrained her. Ethan's eyes were unfocused, his movements uncoordinated, suggesting heavy intoxication. "She's been asking for it all night," he slurred, struggling against Joseph's firm grip. "Following me around, coming on to me. All I did was give her what she wanted." His words ignited a primal rage unlike anything I'd experienced before. Without conscious thought, I lunged forward, breaking Rebecca's embrace to tackle Ethan to the ground. My fist connected with his face repeatedly, each impact accompanied by a sickening sound as cartilage and bone gave way beneath my knuckles. I felt something crack beneath my hand, his cheekbone or nose. I neither knew nor cared. All I knew was that my brother, my twin, had finally crossed the ultimate line, and something in me had irrevocably broken in response.